Such a pretty song. I really hate to turn it off. Continuing the song we started yesterday, Hatov by Eitan Katz from his second Unplugged album. How's everybody doing? Let's light up the darkness. Who is with us on a Monday evening and a good Hodesh Tov. It's the second day of Rosh Chodesh as we welcome the new Hebrew month of Iyar. Very special month. It's the only month in the Hebrew calendar that has a mitzvah, a commandment associated with every day of the month because we're counting the Omer during every day of this month. Last night we counted 16 as we work our way from Passover to Shavuos, which would be on the 50th day. Who is with us? James in Indianapolis, Bill in mid-Missouri, Nancy in North Carolina, Guy in Ohio, Paul in Chicago, Bella in Florida, Yehuda in South Carolina, Belle in Texas, Paul in the Great Northwest, Renee in Indiana, Stephen in New Hampshire, Lucy in Minnesota, Melissa in Great Neck, Rebecca in LA, Michelle in Jupiter, Florida. Welcome. And Lynn in North Texas over there on the YouTube side. Great to be with you and learning together. I don't know what to say about these trolls that keep popping up on our live show. Very often the next day or 2 days later, they reply to your comments and, just insert their junk. As soon as we see them, we ban them from the page. I mean, hopefully this scourge will pass soon. It's only really, been this way in the last few months. And, obviously I don't think anybody's taken in by this garbage. So hopefully they'll move on sooner or later. All right. Where are we? We are in Tractate Yevamos, the 14th volume of the Talmud. We're in chapter 6. Just get set up here. Today, doing page 56, we pick it up near the bottom of 55b. We're discussing the first Mishna here in chapter 6, and we're defining when yibum, right? So the levirate obligation to marry your brother's widow when he dies childless. When has it actually been performed? Yibum is actually performed with intercourse, and so the sages are needing to define when intercourse has actually occurred, both from the point of view of what was the intention, was it done wittingly or unwittingly, intentionally or unintentionally, through coercion or not, and also when the physical act has actually been accomplished. All right, we pick it up there near the bottom of 55b. The Gemara returns to the precise definition of the initial stage of intercourse. Recall that in a whole bunch of areas of the law, not only yibum, but for example, if you've committed the sin of incest, which obviously would also require intercourse, well, when have you actually done that? And the sages have been equating the initial stage of intercourse equals intercourse, right? Like, what does it mean that you just kind of did it, or did you actually do it? At what point does intercourse become intercourse? And they're actually, for a long time, they said, okay, the initial stage of intercourse equals intercourse. What is the source for that, etc.? Now they're going to define what does the initial stage of intercourse mean? What does that defined term mean? So Shmuel said, the definition of the initial stage of intercourse is a kiss. Now, when he says a kiss here, he doesn't mean that two people kiss on the lips. This is the external contact of the sexual organs. And Shmuel explains, this is comparable to a person who places his finger on his mouth, and it is impossible that he does not press the flesh of his lips. And similarly, when there is contact of the sexual organs, there will certainly be at least a tiny amount of penetration, and this is considered an act of sexual intercourse. So when Rabbi Bar Chana came from Eretz Yisrael, he said that Rabbi Yochanan said the completion of intercourse stated with regard to a designated maidservant. This was the case of a Canaanite slave betrothed to a Jewish slave. That's a specific situation. And that's called the designated maidservant. and the completion of intercourse, and they're talking about the completion of intercourse because with regard to the betrothal of a Canaanite slave to a Hebrew slave, that there, the Torah actually uses the word, what do they call it? The conjugation, cohabitation with seed. And for that case, the sages said, okay, in that case, they need a complete act of intercourse. Every other time where intercourse produces the sin, the initial stage of intercourse is enough. So that's why they're needing to distinguish between the initial stage of intercourse and a complete act of intercourse or cohabitation with seed. So says Rabbi Yochanan, the completion of intercourse stated with regard to a designated maidservant. What is this? It is the insertion of the corona and no more. And Rav Sheshes raised an objection based on the following Baraisa. The phrase cohabitation with seed indicates that one is liable to receive punishment for violating such a transgression only for a complete act of sexual intercourse. And what? Does this not refer to the complete insertion of the male member? And the Gemara responds, no, it is possible that it is referring to the complete insertion of the corona. We might have thought that a complete act of intercourse means that they have sex and there's, ejaculation, but that's not what they mean at all. The initial stage means just some amount of penetration, and if there's a complete penetration, that's it. They've had sex. It makes sense. When Rav Dimi came from Eretz Yisrael, he said that Rabbi Yochanan said the definition of the initial stage of intercourse is the insertion of the corona, right? I guess the head of the male member. And they said to him, but Rabba Bar Bar Chana did not say so, as he taught that Rabbi Yochanan said that the insertion of the corona constitutes a complete act of intercourse. They're both citing Rabbi Yochanan and claiming a different outcome of this legal question. And is it not considered? I'm sorry. Rabbi Bar Bar Chana said no. That's not what Rabbi Yochanan said. Rabbi Yochanan said that the insertion of the corona is a complete act of sexual intercourse and is not considered merely the initial stage of intercourse. He said to them, well, either he lied, right? Either Rabbi Bar Bar Chana lied or I lied, meaning Rav Dimi. Either he lied or I am lying. There's clearly a contradiction, and one of us cited Rabbi Yochanan's opinion incorrectly. Doesn't mean we did it on purpose, but one of us is wrong. So when Ravin came from Eretz Yisrael, whenever they say came from Eretz Yisrael, meaning from the Jewish community in the land of Israel during the Roman occupation over to the Jewish community in Bavel, in Babylonia, then part of the Persian Empire. So when Ravin came from Eretz Yisrael, he said that Rabbi Yochanan said the definition of the initial stage of intercourse is the insertion of the corona. And the Gemara comments, he certainly disagrees with Rabbi Bar Bar Chana, who cited Rabbi Yochanan as stating that insertion of the corona constitutes a complete act of sexual intercourse. So shall we say that he also disagrees with Shmuel, who defined the initial stage of intercourse as external contact of the sexual organs, right? So we seem to have two opinions on what is the initial stage, either just a touching of the male sexual organ to the female sexual organ, or the initial stage is insertion of the head of the penis, and a contradiction on what is the definition of the complete act of intercourse, either just inserting the head of the penis or the entire member. So shall we say that he also disagrees with Shmuel, who defined the initial stage as simply external contact? And the Gemara responds, well, no, it is possible that there is no dispute between them. And Ravin said that Rabbi Yochanan calls the entire process from the kiss, meaning just the touching of the sexual organs, until the insertion of the corona. All of this is the initial stage of intercourse, while anything beyond that point is considered the complete act of sexual intercourse. And when Rav Shmuel Bar Yehuda came from Eretz Yisrael, he reported that Rabbi Yochanan said the definition of the initial stage of intercourse is the insertion of the corona, whereas a complete act of sexual intercourse is literally a complete act of sexual intercourse, i.e. insertion of the male organ beyond the corona. Now we're on 56a. From this point forward, insertion of anything less than the corona is only considered a kiss, for which he is exempt. In the case of the designated maidservant, he didn't commit anything other than the initial stage of intercourse, and therefore has not done the cohabitation with seed. It was taught in the Mishnah that both one who merely engages in the initial stage of intercourse and one who completes the act of intercourse have thereby acquired the Yevamos. And now we're back to the yibum context, which makes sense because that's what we're studying here in our tractate. So, right, the Yevama, the widow, and her Yavam, they stand to perform either yibum or chalitza. Maybe they're a little tentative. They're not sure if they're going to go through with it, but they get themselves to that point, all right? And so when they've done the initial stage of intercourse, whether that's the kiss or insertion of the corona, at that point, they've done it. It is considered intercourse, and they are thereby married. Right now, they've performed yibum, and they're married. It's done. So Rav said, what does it mean that, so the question is, what does it mean that he has acquired his Yevamos? So normally that means they're married, right? So he has acquired her as a wife. Rav said he has acquired her for everything. In other words, she's considered his wife in all regards. Therefore, if he is a priest, she may partake of teruma, right? If he's a priest, that means the brother who died was also a priest because they're at least paternal half-brothers. And a woman who is, let's say, the daughter of an Israelite, so any person who's not a priest or of a priestly family may not eat teruma, which is consecrated food, which is set aside for priests to eat when the temple is standing. So a normal Israelite like us, like me, I'm not a Cohen, I cannot eat teruma. There's no teruma now because the temple is not standing. But if the temple were to be rebuilt and we're setting teruma aside for priests, only priests and their families can eat it. So a woman who's born of an Israelite father or a Levi father, if she marries a Cohen, if she marries a priest, from the time of their marriage onward, she may partake of the holy food of teruma. And so, if this woman, now why couldn't she eat teruma before? If she was married to the brother and he was a priest, presumably she could eat teruma then. But he died. Right? So a woman who's married to a priest and then he dies, she returns to her father's house, meaning she can no longer eat teruma. But if she then marries his brother, then she can eat teruma again. So Rav, he's acquired her for everything. In other words, she's considered his wife in all regards, and therefore, if he's a priest, she may partake of teruma. And Shmuel said, he has only acquired her with regard to the matters stated in the chapter of levirate marriage, meaning to inherit his brother's property and to exempt her from levirate marriage if he then dies and leaves behind children from another wife. Right? So if the Yavam already had children by another wife, and then he performs yibum with his brother's wife, so now he has a second wife, and his first wife might have died or divorced, right? So, but he already had children, so now he acquires this new wife. If he then dies, but he already had kids, she is no longer a Yavama because now she's the widow of a man who had children. The Gemara adds, if she was a Yevama from marriage, everyone agrees that she may partake of teruma after the initial stage of intercourse with her Yavam, as she was already partaking at the outset when she was married to the deceased brother, who was also a Kohen, a priest. Therefore, even a minimal act of intercourse is enough to allow her to continue to partake of teruma. But where they disagree, it is with regard to a Yevama from betrothal. Why? Because a woman who is betrothed to a priest. Now, we've talked many times about the difference between betrothal and marriage, right? The difference between kiddushin and erusin, the difference between betrothal and then the consummation of that marriage. So when a woman is betrothed under Jewish law, she's considered marriage in that she's prohibited to every other man in the world, and if they want to break it off, they need a bill of divorce. but they haven't completed the marriage process. And one aspect of that lack of completion is that if he's a priest, she may not eat teruma until they consummate the marriage. So, a woman who's betrothed to a guy and he dies childless, right? She is a Yevama. If he has a surviving brother, they need to perform yibum or chalitza to release her. But until they do perform yibum, for example, she hasn't been able to eat teruma because she was only betrothed to the brother that died, and she won't be able to eat teruma until she performs yibum with her yavam. So Rav said, so where they disagree is with regard to a yavama from betrothal. Rav said she may partake, as the merciful one includes unwitting intercourse and the other forms of intercourse listed in the Mishna, and considers them like intentional intercourse, and somehow this is going to change the status of her betrothal with the yavam. Let's just keep reading. And Shmuel said, when the merciful one includes these forms of intercourse, witting and unwitting, intentional and unintentional, he does so only to establish the yavam in the place of the husband. But to strengthen him more than the husband, no. Since she was merely betrothed to the deceased brother, she was not permitted to partake of teruma, and therefore she may not partake of teruma at this point either. Right? I guess we're referring to they didn't do, here I'm confused. I'm a little bit confused. What does it mean that at this point, right? And let's just get a note on this discussion. What does it mean that he has acquired his Yevama? This is a note from Rav Steinsaltz. The commentaries disagree over the meaning of this passage. According to Tosafos, the Ramban, and the Rashba, the discussion concerns a case in which his intercourse was deficient because he did not intend thereby to perform levirate marriage. Okay. So that it was unwitting in that sense. He intended to have intercourse with her, but not for the purpose of performing yibum. So that intention was lacking. Now our Mishna says, but they had intercourse. So the fact that they had intercourse means they performed yibum. However, if he intended to perform levirate marriage and engaged only in the initial stage of intercourse, all agree that they are fully married, and this is considered a complete act of intercourse. Okay, so he intended to perform yibum with her, and they only did the initial stage of intercourse. Okay, that's it. They're done. They're married. But if he was intending to, have sex with her in some form, but it wasn't for the purpose of levirate marriage, even though she was in a yibum situation with him, and then he only did the initial act of intercourse, the initial stage of intercourse, now that you're lacking, two elements of completion, he had the wrong intention in having intercourse with her, and he barely had intercourse with her. Even according to one opinion like Shmuel's, all they did is that their sexual organs touched. There was no actual insertion at all. So here is where there's a disagreement, and possibly he has not acquired his Yevama. Conversely, the Rif apparently understood that the discussion also applies to anyone who performs only the initial stage of intercourse. The Rambam explicitly endorses this opinion as well. According to this opinion, when the Gemara mentions unwitting and intentional intercourse, it is merely citing examples, but does not mean to exclude the case of one who performs only the initial stage of intercourse. The Aruch Laner claims that the Rif is consistent with his opinion that the initial stage of intercourse consummates a marriage only if the woman had previously been betrothed to the man. Consequently, the Amoraim here dispute whether the levirate bond is sufficiently strong to allow the levirate marriage to be consummated via the initial stage of intercourse and not a complete act of intercourse. So that's, now we understand what it is that they're arguing about. Okay. Okay. Now Shmuel follows his regular line of reasoning. As Rav Nachman said that Shmuel said, in any case where the woman's marriage to her original husband entitles her to partake of teruma, so she was married to a priest, intercourse with the yavam, the surviving brother, in any of the manners described in the Mishnah, also entitles her to partake of teruma. And in any case where her relationship with her original husband does not entitle her to partake of teruma, i.e., if she had been betrothed but not married, so then intercourse with the Yavam, in the manners described in the Mishnah, which includes as unwitting or only the initial stage of intercourse, does not entitle her to partake of teruma. So the Gemara raises an objection from the following Baraisa. In the case of a mentally competent daughter of an Israelite who was betrothed to a competent priest, and he did not have a chance to marry her before he became a deaf mute. Now, a deaf mute just has a different meaning than what we are accustomed to, in the sense that, we would never say that a person who is deaf mute is not mentally competent to enter into contracts, for example. But in ancient times, that was the law. They didn't have sign language. Somebody who was both deaf and mute, they could never be sure that this person understood, the contract that they were entering into. And so their capacity was understood as being limited. So in this case, if there was a competent, just a mentally competent daughter of an Israelite who was betrothed to a competent priest, but before they consummated that marriage, he became a deaf mute and therefore legally not competent to enter into agreements, including marriage in this way, or including performing this act with full intention, right? So if the competent daughter of an Israelite who was betrothed to a competent priest, and he did not have a chance to marry her before he became a deaf mute, and he was no longer legally, mentally competent, so she may not partake of teruma, as marriage to a deaf mute does not enable a woman to partake of teruma. Now the deaf mute husband can eat teruma because he's a priest, but I guess he can't enter into a marriage in such a way to allow the wife to partake of teruma also. So if the deaf-mute husband subsequently died, and the Yevama happened before a deaf-mute Yavam for levirate marriage, she may partake of teruma. And in this regard, the strength of the Yavam is greater than the strength of the husband. Granted, according to Rav, this works out well, as intercourse with a deaf-mute Yavam, which is comparable to the unwitting intercourse mentioned in the Mishnah, because the deaf-mute is not considered legally competent to enter into that act, affects the levirate marriage and allows her to partake of teruma despite the fact that she could not do so during the lifetime of her first husband. However, according to Shmuel, this is difficult, as he maintains that a Yavam cannot have more rights than the deceased husband due to intercourse undertaken without the intent to perform levirate marriage. So the Gemara answers, Shmuel could have said to you, amend the Baraisa and say as follows. If he did not have a chance to marry her before he became a deaf mute, she may not partake of teruma. If he married her and afterward became a deaf mute, she may partake of teruma because she had a permitted time. They had a valid marriage. The fact that he became deaf mute later doesn't change that. So if he then died and she happened before a deaf mute Yavam for levirate marriage, she may partake of teruma. And we're not going to get into it here, but we've studied this before together, and we saw that as difficult as this is to the modern ear, even the sages themselves 2,000 years ago had all kinds of limitations on ascribing incompetence to somebody who is a deaf mute. He had to be both deaf and mute, and there were instances where if he could demonstrate that he's competent, it didn't apply, right? So there was all kinds of limitations on that, but that's outside the scope of this class today. So, what is the meaning of the phrase, in this regard, the strength of the Yavam is greater than the strength of the husband? It means to say that if the original husband was a deaf mute from the outset, i.e. before consummating the marriage, she would not have been allowed to partake of teruma. Whereas, interesting, he can't marry her in order to allow her to partake of teruma, but he's marrying her, right? So he can marry her. It just doesn't allow her to partake of teruma. Whereas if the Yavam was a deaf mute from the outset, she may partake of teruma once they perform levirate marriage because she had been fully married to the deceased brother. And some say a different version of the dispute between Rav and Shmuel. If she was a Yevama from betrothal, i.e. her marriage with the deceased brother had never been completed, and she and the brother-in-law engaged in an inferior form of intercourse as described in the Mishnah, it was unwitting or unintentional or just the initial stage, so then everyone agrees that she may not partake of teruma, as she did not partake of teruma in her husband's lifetime, because she was only betrothed to him. When they disagree, it is with regard to a Yevama from marriage. She was fully married to the priest, and Rav says she may partake of teruma as she was permitted to partake of teruma initially during the first marriage and while married to the brother now deceased. And Shmuel says she may not partake of teruma because when the merciful one includes unwitting intercourse and considers it like intentional intercourse, it was only with regard to the matters stated in the chapter of levirate marriage, but for every other issue, not necessarily including partaking of teruma. Before we continue, what is the law? What is the halacha? The halacha: if a woman from a non-priestly family was betrothed to a priest, and before they were fully married, he became a deaf-mute and was no longer mentally competent, she may not partake of teruma. If he died and she performed levirate marriage with her deaf-mute yavam, she still may not partake of teruma. However, if her first husband married her and only then became a deaf-mute, she may partake of teruma. If he then died and she performed levirate marriage with her deaf-mute yavam, she may partake of teruma because she was initially permitted. The Gemara raises a difficulty. Didn't Rav Nachman say that Shmuel himself said, in any case where the woman's marriage to her original husband entitles her to partake of teruma, intercourse with the yavam in one of the manners listed in the Mishnah also entitles her to partake of teruma? The Gemara answers, amend the wording and say as follows: with regard to any act of intercourse through which the husband entitles her to partake of teruma, a yavam also entitles her to partake of teruma. And with regard to any act of intercourse through which the husband does not entitle her to partake of teruma, the yavam also does not entitle her to partake of teruma. Just as betrothal cannot be performed via an unwitting act of intercourse, this act does not entitle a yavama to partake of teruma. Interesting that unwitting intercourse does create yibum, but it does not create betrothal. The Gemara, at least according to Shmuel. So the Gemara raises an objection from the following baraisa. In the case of a mentally competent daughter of an Israelite who was betrothed to a competent priest, and he did not have a chance to marry her before he became a deaf-mute and was no longer mentally competent, she may not partake of teruma. If the deaf-mute husband subsequently died, and the yavama happened before a deaf-mute yavam for levirate marriage, she may partake of teruma. And in this regard, the strength of the yavam is greater than the strength of the husband. Granted, according to Rav, he can answer as Shmuel answered initially, i.e. according to the first version of the dispute between Rav and Shmuel. However, according to Shmuel, it is difficult. And the Gemara concludes, indeed, it is difficult. The sages taught, in the case of a mentally competent daughter of an Israelite who was betrothed to a mentally competent priest and he did not have a chance to marry her before he became a deaf-mute and was no longer mentally competent, she may not partake of teruma. If a son was born to her from this priest, she may partake of teruma on account of her son. The mother of a priest can eat teruma. But if the son died, Rabbi Nassan says she may continue to partake of teruma, and the rabbis who disagree with Rabbi Nassan say she may not continue to partake of teruma. The Gemara asks, what is the reasoning of Rabbi Nassan? And Rabbah said, since she has already partaken of teruma in a permitted manner, she may continue. Abaye said to him, well, however, if that is so, in the case of the daughter of an Israelite man, and she was married to a priest, and he died childless, she should be allowed to partake of teruma, as she has already been permitted to partake of teruma. If the mother of a priest can keep eating teruma when her son dies, why shouldn't the wife of a priest be allowed to keep eating teruma after her husband dies? Rather, it must be that according to this reasoning, it must be that since the son has passed away, his priestly sanctity has left her, and she is considered a regular Israelite in all regards. Here too, since the son, that's with the husband, and here too, since the son has passed away, his priestly sanctity has left her, and therefore she should not be entitled to partake of this consecrated food. And Rabbah's explanation should consequently be rejected. Rather, Rav Yosef said, Rabbi Nassan holds that the marriage of a deaf mute who was competent when he betrothed his wife entitles her to partake of teruma, and we do not issue a decree against the wife partaking of teruma through marriage to a deaf mute due to the case of betrothal to a deaf mute. Although the betrothal of a deaf mute does not take effect, his consummation of marriage does take effect and entitles his wife to partake of teruma. So that's interesting, a new wrinkle here. So we're saying that the deaf mute not competent to betroth a wife, but is competent to marry a wife. And that's why a betrothal, it's only to the betrothal to a deaf mute priest that doesn't entitle her to eat teruma, but marriage to the deaf mute would. Abaye said to him, if so, why do I need the Baraisa to specify that a son was born to her? She should be entitled to eat teruma even if she did not have a son. Rav Yosef responded, that case is mentioned due to the opinion of the rabbis who hold that she is entitled to partake of teruma only if she has a child. Abaye asks further, and let Rabbi Nassan disagree with them in the first clause of the Baraisa as well. And Rav Yosef responds, Rabbi Nassan left the rabbis until they finished their statement, and then he disagreed with all their statements. And the Gemara asks, if so, let the Baraisa first teach that if the son died, she may not partake of teruma, and subsequently state, Rabbi Nassan said she may eat. Why is Rabbi Nassan's opinion mentioned before the rabbis finished stating their opinion? The Gemara concludes, indeed, this is difficult according to Rabbi Yosef. It was taught in the Mishnah, and so too, one who had intercourse with any of those with whom relations are forbidden by the Torah, the incestuous relationships, in any form, is liable to receive punishment. Right? Any form of sex that you had with an incestuous relationship, if you had any kind of sex, now you're liable for punishment. So Rav Amram said, this matter was said to us by Rav Sheshas. Now, when we say any kind of sex, we're saying intercourse, whether willing or unwilling, witting or unwitting, whether coerced or not, and presumably even the initial stage of intercourse. Rav Amram said, this matter was said to us by Rav Sheshas. Now we're in 56b. And he illuminated our eyes from the Mishnah, i.e. he demonstrated that the Mishnah serves as the basis for his opinion with regard to the wife of an Israelite who was raped. Although she is permitted to her husband, she is disqualified for the priests. Right? So this is just one of those things. So, God forbid, it's a terrible, unimaginable, awful thing. A married woman is raped, obviously against her will. She didn't do anything wrong. She did not commit adultery, and therefore, even though she had sex with some other man, because she was raped, she remains permitted to her husband. But the priest had this special exalted status, and just like a regular priest not allowed to marry a divorced woman, and a high priest not even allowed to marry a widow, likewise, a woman who was raped by a man not her husband, she will now become disqualified from marrying a priest. And if they do it, I think they would step in and make them divorce, or at the very least, the priest would be disqualified from serving in the priesthood. It's just one of those things. So a woman, the wife of an Israelite who was raped, although she is permitted to her husband, she's disqualified for priests. Therefore, if her husband dies, she may not marry a priest. And the Tana of our Mishnah also taught, and so too in the case of one who had intercourse with any one of those with whom relations are forbidden, the arayos, by the Torah, or with those who are unfit to marry him, even though they are not in the category of arayos, the woman, if she did that, if she committed that transgression, she becomes forever disqualified from marrying a priest. Now, what is the meaning of the phrase, and so too? What is it not that it is no different whether they have intercourse unwittingly or intentionally, and it is no different whether they have intercourse due to coercion or willingly. And it is taught that he has rendered her disqualified from marrying a priest. The Gemara refutes this. No, What is the meaning of the phrase, and so too? It is referring to the initial stage of intercourse, as this also invalidates her from marrying the priest. And the Gemara asks, disqualifies her from marrying a priest. And the initial stage of intercourse of whom? If we say it is referring to those with whom relations are prohibited and carry a punishment of charis or death in the case of arayos, is this to say that the law with regard to those with whom relations are prohibited is derived from the law with regard to a yevama, as implied by the phrase, and so too? On the contrary, we derive the law of a yevama from the law of those with whom relations are prohibited, as the main source that indicates that the initial stage of intercourse is considered intercourse. This comes from the law of those with whom relations are prohibited, and then we apply it to the law of the yevama and not vice versa. So rather, what is the meaning of the phrase, and so too? It is referring to atypical, i.e. anal sexual intercourse with those with whom relations are prohibited, the arayos. And the Gemara rejects this suggestion. On the contrary, the main source that atypical intercourse is equated with intercourse is based on the verse, the cohabitations of a woman in Leviticus 18:22, which is written with regard to those with whom relations are prohibited. So whether you had it in the typical manner or the atypical manner, if you had sex, if you had incestuous sex, you had incestuous sex. You violated that prohibition, whether, in front or from behind. Rather, what is the meaning of the phrase, and so too? It is referring to atypical intercourse by those liable for violating an ordinary prohibition, right? A prohibition that is not at the level of incestuous relationships listed in the Torah, but just rather a prohibition that is not punishable by charis. Like if a priest marries a divorced woman, for example, with regard to whom the expression, the cohabitations of a woman, does not appear. In any event, Rav Shesh's proof from the Mishna is not conclusive. Rava said, with regard to the wife of a priest who was raped, her husband, the priest, is flogged if he later has intercourse with her. I mean, this is a tragedy, right? There's nothing but tragic if such a circumstance would occur, right? The temple is standing, priests are serving in the temple, there's a married priest, his wife gets raped. If he was not a priest, okay, she had a terrible experience, but the marriage doesn't get broken up by it. But because he's a priest, if he remains married with her, then he's violating his obligations as a priest. So if he, sets aside his obligations as a priest and says, well, no, I'm just going to stay with my wife, I don't need to be a priest, he is flogged for that, according to Rava. Why? If he's flogged if he later has intercourse with her, due to the fact that it is prohibited for a priest to have intercourse with a zona. And the Gemara expresses surprise. Due to the prohibition proscribing a zona? Yes. Due to ritual impurity? No. The Torah refers to a married woman who has intercourse with another man as ritually impure, and she is forbidden to her husband. This is adultery. The Gemara amends Rava's statement, say that he is also flogged due to the prohibition with regard to a zona. He's flogged because he had relations with a woman who was disqualified as a zona, and because she became impure when she was raped. Rabbi Zera raised an objection based upon a verse with regard to the sota, the suspected adulteress. And neither was she taken, from Numbers 5:13. This phrase indicates that she is forbidden to her husband because she willingly committed adultery. But if she was forcibly taken, if she was raped, then she's permitted to her husband. The term "and she" indicates that although these principles apply in this case, you have another case of a woman who is prohibited even though she was forcibly taken. And which is this? This is the wife of a priest. And a prohibition that stems from a positive mitzvah, i.e. the prohibition proscribing a priest's wife to her husband if she has been raped, which is derived from the fact that the Torah indicates that the wife of an Israelite remains permitted. The wife of an Israelite who was raped remains permitted because she's the wife of an Israelite. The wife of a priest does not remain permitted to her husband if she is raped. So this is a prohibition that comes from a positive mitzvah. But a prohibition that stems from a positive mitzvah, like the prohibition prescribing a priest's wife to her husband if she has been raped, which is derived from the fact that the Torah indicates that the wife of an Israelite remains permitted, this has the status of a positive mitzvah. It acts like a prohibition, but in terms of punishments, it's not a prohibition. It's actually just the inverse of a positive mitzvah. Consequently, one should not be flogged for this offense, as one is flogged only for violating an actual negative prohibition from the Torah. Rabbah said in response to this, all married women who engaged in extramarital intercourse were included in the category of zona. When the verse specified with regard to the wife of an Israelite, and neither was she taken, as it is only in that case that she is forbidden, it thereby indicates that if in fact she was raped, she remains permitted. By inference, unlike the wife of an Israelite, the wife of a priest remains as she was. Since the Torah does not limit the category of zona with regard to the wife of a priest, she is considered a zona even if she was raped and would be prohibited to her husband. Does he get flogged if he stays with her? That seems to be a negative. And I mean, he does not. And some say a different version of this discussion. Rabbah said, with regard to the wife of a priest who was raped, and let's just read what the law ends up in this case, because we're almost done. So if you have questions or comments, get them in. The halacha. The wife of a priest who was raped is forbidden to her husband. If he engages in intercourse with her, he is flogged for violating the prohibition against having intercourse with the zona. So Rabbah's opinion prevailed in accordance with the first version of Rabbah's statement. Tragic. And some say a different version of the discussion. Rabbah said with regard to the wife of a priest who was raped, her husband is flogged for having intercourse with her due to her ritual impurity. And the Gemara asked, due to ritual impurity? Yes. Due to the prohibition against zona? No. Apparently in the case of rape, the victim is not called a zona. But Rabbi Zera raised an objection from the verse, and neither was she taken, which indicates she is forbidden to her husband because she willingly committed adultery. But if she was raped, she is permitted to her husband. The term and she indicates that although these principles apply in this case, you have another case of a woman who is forbidden even though she was forcibly taken. And who is this? The wife of a priest. And a prohibition that stems from a positive mitzvah has the status of a positive mitzvah, not a prohibition. Consequently, one should not be flogged for this offense, as one is flogged only for violating an actual negative prohibition. And Rabbah said, all were included in the verse, her former husband who sent her away may not take her again to be his wife after she was made ritually impure. And when the verse specified, with regard to the wife of an Israelite, and neither was she taken, as it is only in that case that she is forbidden, it thereby indicates she was forcibly taken, so she is permitted. But by inference, the wife of a priest remains as she was, and she is forbidden to the priest. So this is where, a situation where it's tragic that she happened to be married to a priest. Tragic for her, tragic for him. But I think, he could still, he's prohibited, right? So if he decided to be with her, he would just be in violation of the law. I don't know if there's any other, outs that they would find for them where he could just say, I don't want to serve as a priest anymore, but I want to remain with my wife because I love her. I don't know if there was any way, any mechanism for them to do that. Okay, that's the end of our daf today. We're near the bottom of 56b, and we'll pick that up tomorrow with a new Mishnah, Mishnah number 2 here in chapter 6. All right, let's see if we have any questions or comments. Okay, Lynn, these pages are very graphic. Can't say they didn't think of everything. And to think that they were still being evasive and cloaked, oh my. I mean, it's just... These are issues where there are legal ramifications. So the sages were going to explore that. They weren't going to leave any question of Torah law unexamined, undiscussed, undebated, no matter how, difficult that discussion would be because of the intimate issues involved. Sharon, how does anyone know about intention other than the Yevam or Yevama as a condition of completion of the obligation? That's a really good question. And I think the answer to that would be, first, it doesn't matter what the intention actually was because they're so often in the hypothetical situation anyway. So the presumption is they would know because, the Yevam said so or the Yevama said so. They said what their intention was, or it somehow was established. The point is, what would be the law with intention? What would be the law without intention? Now, if this ever came to a situation where there was a practical matter, and there was a lot at stake, maybe there was a big inheritance at stake or something like that, then, you might end up in the kind of, histrionics of that Johnny Depp trial that's going on right now, where, this formerly married couple is just revealing every intimate detail about their marriage in a court of law. At least they weren't doing it back then on national TV. Presumably this would happen in, closed quarters, as it were. And there was no jury, right? There was the panel of judges, but there was no jury involved there. And presumably when it was this kind of intimate thing, hopefully it was a closed courtroom. But, if the element of intention ended up being the linchpin for judgment that everything turned on, it would be difficult. But at the end of the day, the judges would examine the witnesses and then make a decision. And also, Sharon, are all these extreme conditions for a priest in line with other attributes of perfection, i.e. no physical imperfections, even ones not visible to others? A priest, like an animal sacrifice in service of God, must be without flaw. Exactly, just so. And that idea that the priest had to be without flaw, it sort of just makes sense, but I think really it doesn't make sense, right? It's difficult to the modern ear, but I think it was also difficult to the ear then. This is in the category of chukim, right? These are laws, unlike mishpatim. The mishpatim are the laws that produce justice, and we rationally get them. We understand why stealing and false testimony and murder, all these, so many laws, like we just instinctively get why those laws exist. Whereas many laws in the Torah, like what exactly is tefillin and why we have to wrap it every day, and the law of the red heifer, the classic type of chok, it's just these laws that we do because God said so. And so while on the surface, the idea that a priest would have to be perfect in order to serve, in intimate service to God, it makes sense. We'd want our most perfect priest to be in that place. Still, the idea that any kind of physical blemish, you could have a priest who's absolutely like the most gifted Torah scholar, the best versed in the nation, in the laws of sacrifices, etc., but he got into an accident and lost the tip of his pinky, and now he's disqualified from service, even though it would have no bearing on his ability to perform that service. I think it just falls in the category of a chok, right? One of those laws that we don't understand, but God said so, so we have to follow it. And at the very least, it creates that awe of a system of law that we cannot fully understand. And separates the Jewish people. That some say that that's the reason for the chukim. It just keeps us as a distinct people, separate from the rest of the world. But the sages have always said there are laws that we will never understand, and the best that we can do is to carefully examine all their nuances, so that even though we don't understand the rationale behind them, we can apply them as to the best of our ability. Okay, that's what I've got for us today. And with God's help, we'll open this new chapter. We'll turn the page and open a new chapter tomorrow. Have a great night.